let Chrissy start with our profile once I get the slide to advance.
So today I wanted to cover concolor fir, Abies concolor, or also known as white fir. This is one of my favorite evergreens, and I feel like every tree I ever talk about, it's one of my favorites. I need to stop identifying all of my favorites because I think I just have too many of them. But this tree, the whole state of Nebraska, really, but particularly, you know, the Panhandle or even North Central, like we have less number of trees that do as well as, you know, southeast Nebraska. And so as far as, you know, maybe an alternative to like a blue spruce or maybe just something to put into your diversity of your backyard. Concolor fir is, okay, so you can see here, you know, 30 to 50 feet tall, 20 to 40 feet spread. It's a great evergreen cover for wildlife, not a favorite for deer. You want to avoid sites that are constantly wet or exposed, which I find interesting about the exposed part. And if you look this up and look at a bunch of information on it, it'll say that. But it's also, this tree is zone 3, which I think is, you know, we don't have a lot of zone 3 trees that we plant. Most of the time we're aiming for like that zone 4, maybe even a zone 5. But this tree here is planted at the library in Mitchell, Nebraska, far Panhandle. And there's actually a couple of them planted on this site, and I think there might be a picture of one later. But the neat thing about fir is that it looks a lot like a spruce, but the needles, the way to identify a fir opposed to a spruce is that a fir's needles are flat fir. And so, and then spruce needles, when you pop them off, remind me, Graham, square spruce, the base of the needle is square, is that right?
Yeah, they're kind of diamond shaped.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, yeah. Like when you roll it in between your fingers, it kind of like feels like it's clicking in your fingers, but a fir needle is always flat, 2 sides. And Graham, show me what other pictures. Let's see. Okay, so yep, on the left is the other spruce, and then on the right is, or not spruce, fir, sorry, at the library. And then on the right is another spruce at the library in Scotts Bluff. And apparently these are library trees, but not really. The beautiful part is that you can truly get away with growing this tree all the way across the state. And for the most part, these trees in these pictures are, they're not, of course, it's saying that they could get, what was it, 50 feet tall? I don't know for the Panhandle if, you know, they're relatively slower growing, but they're not like snail speed growing. I mean, these trees at the library, I think, were planted maybe 9 years ago. And this was a picture that I took of this one last fall, I think it was. But Graham, do you have a picture of the needles? The close-up of the needles? I
don't have a close-up of the needles. We could go to that link that you sent.
Yeah, I'll steal your screen real quick. Okay. So I went back and I mentioned about the, am I sharing? Can you see this?
Yep,
we see it.
Okay, so I mentioned about being in exposed sites. So this is up in Morrill, Nebraska, and you can kind of see, so this is the parking lot to their ball diamond, and they have this strip of trees that they've planted kind of along the south and the west side. And so we've got the highway over here and then a road that leads you into town over there. This tree right here is a concolor fir, and you can kind of tell, like, this is a drier landscape, pretty exposed, and this tree is doing fabulous. I remember when we were going through and doing some tree inventory, it was like we came upon this tree and I looked at it and I just kind of kept staring at it like, man, this is beautiful. And then the closer I got to it, I realized that it had that soft blue tint, sort of an under white color. The back sides of the needles are typically white, but if you go to our website, nfs.unl.edu, you can find concolor fir, white fir on here. And it gives kind of an outline of the species profile. But here you can see those needles again. You see how flat they are, and it's kind of cool because instead of like a spruce, where a spruce sort of holds the needles, you know, all the way around the branch, the fir sort of cups the needles upwards, and the tips of them are typically pointing upward. And so it just creates a different texture. I really think it's interesting. But again, all the way across the state, well-drained soils, it can be drought tolerant. It doesn't really tolerate really wet soils or like really, 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 really dry soils. But as far as that landscape and moral, the minimal water. I mean, that site is receiving minimal water, and that tree is just thriving. Again, bark ashy gray on young trees maturing to dark gray, brown, deeply furrowed and mature trees. Graham had on there, you know, it does really great for our wildlife as far as like winter, and it really is beneficial to our birds. Let's see. Something I thought was interesting that we had on the website was about the use as construction lumber, and that it's commonly grouped together with other species of fir and hemlock and sold under the more general hem fir. So, but of course, so the shape of this tree is very conical. It doesn't really grow outside that shape. And so you don't really have to prune it to get that shape. So if you're really into plants that have form and structure to it, this is one of them to consider adding to your landscape, which I'm actually hunting one right now to put into my landscape as a companion plant with my buffalo grass, because again, with the buffalo grass, it's minimal water. So, and I think back when we had Rachel Allison on the show, she even mentioned that that would be a combination, would be the concolor fir and buffalo grass. But here's another picture of, you know, a much larger one, probably much older. But I mean, in 10 years, you get a sizable tree like what we were looking at just a little bit ago in Graham's pictures. But as far as, like I said, everything's saying like no exposed. And I think it's more about the winter wind. And it can cause a little bit of burning if it gets really bad, if they get dried out. And so, of course, whenever we are going through a period like we are now, where we're not receiving quite as much water and a lot really, really hot, you know, any tree, not just this concolor fir, but any tree, just go out, set the hose on it, let it soak deep for a long time, and then just kind of keep monitoring that soil. You know, go out, stick a screwdriver in the ground, check it out, but also do that throughout the winter. On days that it's above 50 degrees, go out, stick a screwdriver in the ground if it's really, really hard. Because at that top, you know, 6 to 12 inches, it's going to freeze thaw over the series of the winter. It's really the deep soil that's going to probably freeze and stay frozen for a while. But like, I know this year, heck, in January, we had some days that we were up in the 60s and we didn't receive very much moisture for very long. So, I mean, those are just things to take into consideration, but definitely if you are wanting to plant some evergreens, look at a concolor fir. I just love the color, honestly, and the texture, and it's just something other than a spruce or a pine.
Yeah. And like you said, you have those nice rounded needle tips that are softer to the touch, a little bit more inviting to, you know, touch and interact with than a spruce tree would. I think with those drier conditions, your high quality root system is really going to be a help there, so that the tree can take advantage of as much soil volume as possible, rather than having a root system like a ball of twine that's going to really limit how much water it can get out of the ground when it does fall from the sky. I did have some other pictures here on the left. This is the Lynch property outside of Omaha near Fort Calhoun. We have actually 3 co-champions for concolor fir right now. This is our
That is amazing.
Yeah, that's our former intern Ryan Armbruster, who's now at Kansas Forest Service, and he's standing there for scale. That tree was struck by lightning a couple years later, and is not in as picturesque of shape as it has been in the past. The middle picture is a co-champion that's in Albion, Nebraska, kind of showing that really upright, narrow form that it often has. And then on the right side is a tree from nearby my former house. What this shows is how not only do we have this upright habit, but the tree does have this problematic structure later on of having multiple leaders forking high up in the tree at pretty tight angles. And so there was a lot of shade when that tree was smaller, forcing it to grow upright. And now it's got lots of sun since it's gotten that height that it needs. And so it's putting out multiple leaders on the tree that can have some weak attachment down the road.
I almost wonder, looking at the structure of that one, if it's not one of the cultivars that has been selected to be more upright and more narrow at the base and less wide. I don't know. I love
very possible.
Those are beautiful trees. The other thing I forgot to mention is that this tree was actually selected in 2003 as the Nebraska Great Plants Tree of the Year. And absolutely, it's an award winner and it deserves it for the whole state, really. But
it is a fantastic tree.
You might enjoy hearing about this. We just got a comment from Tara in Wyoming. She's with the community forestry program there, and she's saying they just nominated a new champion white fir in Cheyenne, and she says it's a great tree, 9+ foot circumference and 63 inches tall. So very impressive.
3 buckets. That is awesome. Maybe I need to go visit this tree. She said it's in Cheyenne.
Yeah, Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Yeah.
And I have to get the coordinates for that one.
Yeah, so you're right, Chrissy. It is hard to make heads or tails of the exposure concerns when it is so hardy from a winter standpoint.
Right.
I think in some cases back east where we have a lot of moisture, a lot of humidity collecting in the river valley, and then nighttime temperatures that don't drop below 80, the tree transpires a lot of moisture at those times.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And the other thing too is, it kind of becomes tough is this tree not, like you were saying, it does not want to be in the shade. It really wants to be in the full sun. So it's, if you can kind of find an area, I guess on my property, the idea that I have is on actually the northeast corner of my house, but I kind of have a fence that would protect it, but it's tucking it into the corner of my front porch and the northeast corner of my house. So it'll be somewhat protected as a younger tree, but as it gets older, I don't know. I keep looking at these pictures of these giants and I'm like, the location that I should best fit this tree, but.
Yeah. Yep, definitely. But it's a great one for all of the state, like you said. And so that's a great tree to put a highlight on or a spotlight on and share with everybody for consideration.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're not alone in being tired of spruce and pine everywhere. So there's an alternative we can rely on.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's talk about containers.
Yeah, definitely. I pulled some slides from a presentation I give on this, and I like to start with this quote from the founding president of Florida ISA chapter. The future of the profession of arboriculture begins in the nursery, and I add, and sustainability of urban forestry itself. And what that means is we can't expect to have resilient, long-lived urban forests that provide a lot of benefits if we're starting with poor nursery stock. And so what we're going to discuss today with bald and burlap trees, container trees, and bare root trees is what are some of the pros and cons of these different strategies to selling trees. Because these are all very different than the way trees propagate themselves. When we're talking about these different approaches to selling trees, it's really for human convenience that this is done, as opposed to planting a seed in the ground and getting a tree down the road. So the fourth item here, grow bags, we're going to get into the different newer technologies out next week, and we're going to focus more on the traditional methods of selling trees that you encounter in nurseries all over the place. There are a number of different approaches out there. They have different reasons that a nurseryman would choose one over the other, depending on what their business is focused on, who their clientele predominantly is, and what sort of capacity they have to grow. With balled and burlap trees, we're talking about a tree that was grown in a field, and it's harvested in a ball of soil and put in and wrapped in burlap, and then it has a metal cage put around that to kind of keep the whole thing intact while it's taken and brought into the nursery or delivered directly on site. As you can see, there's a lot of root loss associated with this. Upwards of 90% of the root system can be lost when these trees are harvested. Some nurseries will actually go through with the piece of equipment called an air spade that digs the trees out. And occasionally they will root prune the trees in the field with the air spade and pull it back out. And they're not harvesting the tree at that time. They're clipping those roots to encourage more branching inside the root ball and minimize the root loss. But regardless of practices, root loss and the energy that's stored in those roots is the downside of this approach to growing trees.
Well, and an important thing to that, Graham, is to think about, we have to remember that just like the structure of the tree above ground, we have, the trunk, the main, then we have the branches, the second, and then we have the twigs, the third. So we have the same sort of thing happening underground. We have the main roots, then we have the next smaller roots, and then we have the really, really fine roots. And it's those fine roots that are actually bringing that moisture, bringing the nutrients into the plant system and really feeding it. And so imagine, stitching your mouth closed and you aren't able to feed yourself. Like you're ultimately removing that function of that body, of that tree, and not allowing it to do that. And so when we talk about root loss, really we're more concerned about the number of small roots. So when you say 90% of, the roots, that's a huge chunk of what's feeding that tree. And so basically it starts to go into some sort of a shock. And essentially, and that's something to consider is, we want big trees and we want big trees right now, but they come with a cost. They really do.
Yeah, definitely. And that's such a great point, Chrissy, because it's the fine fibrous roots that are doing the actual absorption of water and nutrients from the soil for the tree's benefit. The larger roots that get to be the size of my finger or larger, those are really roots for anchorage and for storage and just kind of keeping the tree upright. And so they're not doing a lot of benefit for the tree as it tries to establish in its new planting hole compared to all those fibrous roots. One thing you'll note here is that this comparison between the top and bottom tree. When you have a field that has lots of trees grown for balled and burlap selling, there's a lot of soil being moved around, and sometimes in the field that soil can be deposited at the base of other trees that haven't been harvested yet. So then you end up in that case with a tree that's deep in the ball and it has even less root system still left behind because of the deposition of soil towards the top. That's also a confounding factor in getting the tree planted at the right depth, which we can certainly go into detail on in a future episode with planting practices. So just a few things on balled and burlapped. Some studies have shown up to 95% of the original root system lost when they're harvested. Those roots will form callus tissue to sort of seal off the wounds, but that's going to sap energy away from the tree, energy that's already really strongly needed to reestablish that root to shoot ratio. So as Chrissy mentioned with transplant shock, when we have an imbalance of roots to shoots, top to bottom, then the tree is not going to grow very much until it gets that root system reestablished in the ground. The analogy that I like to use is the root system of a tree is the bank account and the top of the tree is the bills. Okay, we've lost a lot of the bank account by harvesting that tree from the field. So it's going to take some time to grow the bank account before we're going to take on more bills as that tree might when it starts to grow later.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I love it.
So there's a lot of, maybe controversy isn't the right word, but a lot of different opinions about how best to plant these trees. which of this material is really important to take off and which is important to leave in place. I think if you had 10 arborists in a room, you'd get 10 different opinions about how this is done best. How have you planted bald and burlap trees in the past, Chrissy?
Well, typically we try to dig the hole relative to the size and set the tree down into the hole so that way you're working it in the hole. Because it's not going to hurt the tree if the hole is 3 times wider than the root system, than the ball, but ultimately it's the depth that you don't want to get wrong. And so starting lower is better. But the thing is at minimum, one, it's good to know what the nursery was using, what kind of material they used to ball this. Because if it was old-fashioned burlap that is going to take years and years and years and years and years to disintegrate in the soil, then that's definitely a material that you don't want to leave in the ground. But as far as the cage itself, typically, you set it down in and take the cage off while the tree is in the hole. So that way you're reducing or minimizing the amount of moving and disruption, because again, that soil has, over time settled from all the watering, and it's sort of become connected to each other. And then you have all the little fine baby roots that are growing in between those connections. And ultimately the idea is that if you disrupt the connection of the root, then you're going to be breaking even more of those fine feeder roots off from the root system. And so then you end up with more root loss.
Right.
I understand that. There's also some people that strongly believe in taking a hose to it and they completely bare root it. And I think you're just taking a really big chance if you go that way. But there is some burlap that now what I've seen on some bald trees, some smaller evergreens, is that they're actually leaving the bottom of the ball open so that there's no material kind of underneath it, as far as like they like cut the burlap so that the bottom of it's open. The burlap's on the sides, and then it's wrapped with a bunch of twine instead of wire. And the idea is that the twine and the burlap will disintegrate within, I want to say it's at least 2 years. I don't know for sure. But when it comes, it's always like wrapped really tight, like a scarf kind of around the neck of the trunk, the base of the tree. And that where the material's all built up, I think it's really important to make sure that you pull all that away from the trunk so it doesn't begin to girdle it, because that's too much concentration of that material in one place for it to dissolve. If it's a single layer that will erode away faster through watering and the roots can kind of grow in and around it, then I don't think it's as much of a problem to leave it on the sides. But
yeah,
just there's so many different types of material and so many different ways that trees are all balled and burlapped, and it's just, you have to kind of know what you're dealing with. And there's not one answer, like you were saying. There's not one answer for every single balled and burlap tree. And so
yeah,
either way, it's always better to start with a smaller one, because like you said, the root to shoot ratio, you don't want to mess that up.
right. And we'll be covering planting practices as we come into fall a little bit, but it's hard not to talk about it at least a little bit in relation to these different tree container types,
Right.
and how it plays into that. So you'll notice that there's been some soil pulled away from the base of the tree, so the planter can have a better sense of how deep that hole needs to be. Finding that root flare and those first order roots before digging that hole, because that's a heavy ball of soil right there. And it's not coming back out of the hole very easily once it goes in. So you better have that depth right when it first goes in. But I totally agree about leaving that cage in place. If I can't get to that cage with my bolt cutters when it's in the hole, then I haven't dug a wide enough hole in the first place. So that's a great way of kind of keeping myself honest when I'm planting large trees like this. So there's that flare. This looks like a grafted tree of some sort in this case, and there's definitely a lot, 2 or 3 different schools of thought on burying or exposing those graft unions as well. Yeah, yep. But if we sort of pull that apart, you can see the really large roots that are stubbed off and left behind, with much less evidence of fine feeder roots, even though they are present there as well. So a huge ball of soil can leave you with a fairly small root system in some cases. This isn't necessarily typical for B&B trees. It's worth mentioning that nursery practices are so important with all this. It's not the arrow, it's the Indian. It's not the ordnance, it's the soldier. You know, use whatever analogy you want, but all of these containers can be done well or poorly.
Right.
So if that tree is deep in the ground in the field, then we can have a much smaller root system left behind in that ball that you buy. It's
The
also
thing is like, it's so hard because unless you have like some magical X-ray vision to know what sort of root system you're getting out of that ball, and you know, you either take the chance of removing all the soil to find out so you know, or you take the chance of not removing any soil and not knowing. And you know, it's sort of just there's quite a bit of risk that goes into the factor of this. But yeah, like you're saying, like those are huge wounds. Like imagine somebody just chopping your arm off. I mean, that's we've got to the point where we've sewn your mouth closed. Now we started to cut limbs off, you know, and then happily, and we expect you to run a mile and, you know, be able to grow a bunch more. Like we can't expect trees to do that. And
it's maybe a smaller point to make, but there's also quite a carbon footprint to these trees with 200-300 pound balls of soil attached to them being shipped by truck all over the country as well, from a handful of locations that the nursery industry grows most of those trees.
Right.
So we can use a survey pin like this to get at least a little bit of a sense of how deep that root system might be in the ball. Yeah. Another problem that comes with these B&B trees sometimes is when they're in the mulch pile in the nursery for too long. And now we have a whole lot of roots that have grown outside of that ball. We have to either dig a hole that accommodates all or some of those roots or clip them off.
Right.
With plastic liners and pots, this is another approach that brings convenience to people buying a tree and taking it home in a size that's still a little bit larger than a bare root tree would be. These come in a lot of different forms, from the black plastic pots on the right that we're all familiar with, to more complicated ones on the left that actually are multi-walled liners that can come apart. So it's not a single piece of plastic, but 4 walls and a base that can be unlocked from each other in order to free the tree for planting. Some containerized stock has root loss associated with it as well. This is from a nursery operation where you'll see the roots being clipped in order to accommodate the size of pot that they're going into. On the left-hand picture, you'll also see some pruners that are actually pneumatic. These are air-powered pruners that are designed to protect the hands, the wrists, the muscles of the person using them, so they're not constantly taking huge pruning cuts with their hands and having a lot of physical problems down the road. So it's a pneumatically assisted pruner in order to get this huge tree smushed into a relatively small pot. Again, I don't need to make the point, but root to shoot ratio, keep that in mind along the way. If you're not clipping lots of roots off the tree, then they're inside the pot. So if we have a lot of initial root loss, we're more like a balled and burlap tree. But if those big roots aren't being clipped off when they go into that pot, then we end up with potential for circling roots, stem girdling roots, different defects that have their own issues, don't they, Chrissy?
Yeah. I honestly, one of my favorite trees to look for that I find really easy to take home is, like a size 5 or a 7, container, a gallon container. And one of the first things I do is I try and, go to the nursery in the spring. And what I'll do is I'll wiggle it just a little bit, wiggle the trunk, and look at the root ball. And if I can see that it's kind of loose soil and moving a little bit, then that tells me that that tree was probably containerized very recently. So I know that and the tree itself, in a 5 or a 7, for the most part, generally, the caliper on it's going to be about the size of my thumb, which in my opinion has a really great root to shoot ratio. as far as, the container size that the roots are fitting in, and then the trunk height. And even that, that's still like a 5 foot tall tree. It could be as tall as 8 feet. It just depends on the species and everything. But trying to find the timing with the nurseries when those trees have not been containerized and left in the container for a long time, at least gets you away from some of these possible root defects if they didn't hack and prune a ton of them off just to fit them inside the container. But we have to think about containers in general. I mean, why do we have trees in containers? The only purpose is to get them from the growing site to its final destination. And if you, like you talked about the carbon footprint earlier, that a tree could be grown in somewhere northern United States. And say you're going to plant it here in Nebraska, that tree has to be grown in the ground there. And then they have to transport it from there to Nebraska to a nursery. And then you have to be able to transport it from the nursery home. And so it's all about ease. How can we get the biggest, how do we get the most out of the least kind of thing?
Yeah.
And so a lot of times some of these things that we would do differently are lost along the way.
Yep. One nice thing about containers is that unlike a balled and burlap tree, we can kind of get a sense of what the root system looks like before we purchase it, right?
Right.
But I do like to urge people to at least find somebody that works there and ask before you go taking the pot off of a tree to look at it. Some nurseries aren't a big fan of that sort of thing, but there really shouldn't be much to hide. And unless the tree was just recently potted up, like you said, you're not doing any harm to the tree.
No.
But a lot of people, when they buy a tree in a container and they take it home and they take the pot off and they see this, they go, wow, look at all these awesome roots that this tree has. This
looks great.
Vigorous, wonderful, fast growing tree. What's the problem with a root system like this?
Yeah, this is not the quick and easy for the nurseryman to get the trees from A to B is not always the quick and easy for the homeowner to get trees from A to B. And it creates a little bit more work. When you get a tree like this, you really need to inspect the roots and detangle them and get all of those shoot tips pointing outward and away from the trunk. Because if you leave them, you're going to end up with a tree that over time, it starts out small and then it just keeps swelling and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually they do that against each other. And if you have a tree too deep in the container, kind of like what you were showing with the balled and burlap, and those roots have now grown up into that soil because they're looking for oxygen or they're taking advantage of the resources available there. And now those roots are above that collar, that transition between the trunk and the root system, and they continue to swell against the trunk, you might end up with a stem girdling root. And so it's not as easy as 1, 2, 3, 1, go buy a tree, 2, dig a hole, and 3, put it in the ground and water it a little bit. That's not, I mean, it could be that easy, but you might be spending more money in a short time to go replace that tree if it doesn't survive.
And we will get into stem girdling roots and all that again when we cover planting practices. But we've got to get away from this sort of thing, right? Where you have a little number 5 pot with a 12. I mean, that cottonwood in the foreground might be 15 feet tall.
I was going to say, I would say maybe even 15 feet. That is crazy.
Right. And this should not be impressive.
No.
To people that are shopping for trees. And you see this a lot in the fall, particularly the big box stores. They have trees that have been, I mean, these trees are on life support. They're getting fertilizer. You can see the yellow pellets of fertilizer in there. Each one has a little drip emitter. They're getting all the water and fertilizer they need to stay alive. And as soon as that tree is taken off life support in the nursery and planted in your front yard, now the problems set in because we have this total imbalance of root to shoot ratio on a tree like cottonwood that,
Graham, tell me why a 1-year tree warranty is good for both the nursery and the homeowner and also bad for the nursery and the homeowner.
Right. So it's great for the nursery because they can show that they're committed to people having a tree that thrives. It's good for the homeowner to feel like they have some protection if the tree has a problem. The problem is that trees rarely fail in those sort of time frames. Even a 2-year warranty that I'm seeing in nurseries back east here is not very impressive to me or much of a consolation if you have all these factors not in place in terms of good rootstock.
Right.
How would you describe it?
I would agree. I mean, you say this all the time. Trees don't die when they're killed, and so it takes time. I mean, you imagine a tree that has been growing for 60 years. You cut it down to a stump. That stump is going to keep suckering. The tree's technically not quote dead, but it's not living. It's not living its best life.
Right.
So for the homeowner, like you said, they get confidence in buying from that nursery, and as far as the nursery, I mean, really, many of them are honest, and they do want the homeowner or the purchaser to be satisfied with their product that they're receiving because they want them to come back and buy more. But ultimately, for the most, on average, trees are not going to die within that first year warrant, like unless they were really on life support, or maybe it was just the wrong tree for the wrong place. Maybe the zoning or the siting was just incorrect, compatibility wise. And so, there's pros and cons of that for both sides, but it's at least something and not nothing. So
right. So the longer the tree sits in that pot, you are buying more root system inside the pot, but that root system is defective by definition of being inside an impervious container that's circular. You're just bound to have those stem girdling roots in place the longer the tree sits in that container. So we're going long on time. This is all great stuff to share. So we'll get into bare root here real quick and then let you guys go for the week. Bare root trees, most of us are familiar with in Nebraska, we have natural resource districts. In other states, it's Department of Natural Resources. Whatever the acronym, your state has a conservation division of some sort that probably sells bare root seedlings. This is a fantastic way to plant trees, particularly when you're trying to get a lot accomplished on very little money. These can be as little as 40 cents a piece up to maybe $1 or $2 a piece in this size. This is something that we use extensively for windbreak plantings, shelter belts, things of that nature. Bare root is really nice because we're not losing roots. We're not, we have the root system completely exposed, so the defects can be addressed. And we're getting that tree in its final planting place at a small size, minimizing all these other problems that we've talked about with the other two methods so far. But how many of you are familiar with bare root trees of a much larger size? This is very possible and something that had been being done in Nebraska, in central Nebraska, up until we lost Jim Klook in central Nebraska. Believe it was an automobile accident that took his life. But Jim was doing bare root gravel bed trees. Tara in Wyoming is familiar with this as well. We've seen it in Cheyenne. This is basically where we can take bare root trees and grow them on in a gravel bed that gives them a well oxygenated environment, constant moisture that they'd get otherwise, and minimizing the defects and the problems that we mentioned with the other two approaches. So this is kind of what that looks like when we're talking about gravel beds specifically. Rather than buying a bare root tree, putting it right in the ground, we're growing it on for a season or two to get it to a larger size, but still bare root.
Right. And that's so cool. I mean, we talked about all those tiny, tiny feeder roots. Like, these are pictures that are showing exactly that. Like, that's what then you kind of face the challenge of, like, they can dry out fast. So of course, this is not something you want to do in the middle of July or even August for that fact, where we're experiencing 100-degree days. We talk about planting in the fall, and August can kind of be that borderline fall, but really it's something that, like, timing with the air temperature and heat stress and other environmental stresses is important, because if you put it in a situation where it's going to lose a lot of water, or you're not able to protect that exposed root ball, they will burn back and die back if they dry out for any reason. So, I mean, with everything, there's always those little things to think about.
Yeah, and I think it's good common sense to say, if I shouldn't be pulling a tree out of a gravel bed situation, if it's a time of year where it's bad to pull it out of the gravel bed, maybe I shouldn't be planting a tree that time of year at all.
Right.
Yeah. You can definitely plant trees in the heat of summer if you choose to, and you commit to keeping it watered as that root to shoot ratio gets back in balance and the tree establishes in the ground. Otherwise, spring and fall is really ideal. And I love fall, partially because it's a growing season that's just for us. It's just for tree lovers. Everything else is getting planted in the springtime. In fall, woody plants are the only thing that you should really probably be considering planting, or I guess tender perennials as well.
Right. The thing too, I mean, and what I like to point out between the difference of fall planting and spring planting, it just depends on who you talk to and why they favor one over the other. But in the fall, the air is cooler, but the ground is still warm. In the spring, the ground is cool and the air is warm. And so if you think about plants, any crop, it's all based on the ground temperatures. And so where the trees are shutting down and putting their energy, well, deciduous trees, and where they're shutting down, they're putting that energy into the root system. If the root system is still in a warm environment, it'll continue to grow and put some energy into that root system. So, it just, the downside to it is that a lot of times in October, our sprinkler systems get shut off and they get blown out. And then we have to go and hand water them all the way through the winter. And, it's really important to make sure that you don't forget about those young trees that are planted in the fall, especially in the winter months. If we get a spell like we did January this year and January last year across parts of the state where we were, regularly in the 50s and 60s and no moisture, that can be really problematic. And that's why a lot of people like to plant in the spring, is because usually we have a lot more natural moisture in the spring. And so I don't think there's one better than the other, but there's definitely a lot of opinions about it, and it's a lot to do with what resources you have available and what timing you can devote to those trees, because for city staff, they don't have, they drop in numbers in the fall and in the winter, and then they pick up in numbers for seasonal help so it just depends on what resources you have and what the general swing of timing is.
Yeah. But if you have small newly planted trees in your landscape and it's, Halloween, mid-October, you're getting ready to put your hoses away for the year, use those hoses a lot, that one last time before you put them away for the winter. And oftentimes maybe around Valentine's Day, you usually get some kind of a warm spell around February where we get kind of an uptick in temperatures, and it would be safe to hook that hose back up in the afternoon, put some water on those trees as you can. It's really going to do a huge service to your newly planted trees, particularly conifers, like we mentioned earlier with white fir, needing that moisture all winter to keep those needles from drying out.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. Ben, do you have any questions for us? We've been chatting a lot.
Yeah.
Huh? What? No, I'm joking. You guys have been great. Actually, I thought Josh, who's been watching this, has a really great question for both of you, and this is kind of a fun one. What is your least favorite tree? And he does add this week anyway. What's your least favorite tree this week?
Go ahead, Chrissy.
I don't know. That's hard.
Okay. I'll go with Tree of Heaven for this week.
Okay.
It is a tenacious tree. It's non-native. It seeds itself about. It sprouts from stumps. It's difficult to kill. It invades natural native woodlands and prairies alike. So if I had a tree to disparage that's one. I can see
Yeah.
benefits to it in some cases, but just
Right.
an all around nasty tree.
I mean, right now I have a love-hate relationship with my woods that I have behind my house, which is like 90% Siberian elm. And between the freezes that we had last October, the freeze we had this spring and April, and the crazy weather that we've had, I've had a couple of them just like they've been standing dead. My chainsaw broke. I pulled the pole all the way out, so I was really upset about that. So they're kind of just standing there taunting me right now. So I need to go get the chainsaw fixed so I can get some of the dead ones out, because it's just I feel like they're sporadically dying out, and so I need to change the diversity of my woods. And I had one fall in my chicken coop. I had one just randomly fall, and the other one's like leaning, and it needs to come down before it falls. So it's kind of one of those like maintenance cleanup things, and it's a bunch of seedlings that had to have come into a planting that was done a really long time ago. There's a few honey locusts mixed in there, but I love the honey locusts, so I don't really, I probably don't swear at them as much, but the
Right.
Siberian elms, I can't complain terribly much too, because I mean they do shade my chicken coop and they do shade my bees, so they're providing a nice windbreak to the north of my house. So it's a love-hate relationship right now.
Yeah. I was gonna say a similar thing, Chrissy. On a personal note, I'm always trying to sort of check my plant bigotry a little bit. Um, Siberian elm not only shades Chrissy's chicken coop, it shades a lot of our Western Nebraska communities.
Right.
And it is a non-native. It can be aggressive. Those are facts. But there's also a more complicated story behind all of these trees. And so it's always good to find where there may be appropriate uses for these trees, even though we disparage them in most contexts.
Right. So
Okay.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, good answers, guys. Yeah, thanks to everybody who tuned in today. I think this is a really good episode, and of course, we'll be back again next week. That's next Thursday at 12:30 Central Time. If you watch the show and you think of a question later on, feel free to leave that question in the comment box, or you can send it to us an email at trees@unl.edu. Chrissy and Graham, thanks as always, and hope you guys have a good rest of your week and a good weekend.
yeah.
You too.
Thanks,
Thanks, everybody.
Ben. See
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Graham.
Bye.